The Woman in the Sea by Harold Hartman. She came in on a long line, over stern, and poured onto the working deck with another 1,000 black cod. Usually the most we've ever picked up was a shark. But a lady? That was a head-scratcher. Not so much that she was naked, and not so bad a job at that either, but the fact that she was still breathing after being so far underwater for who knows how long. First Mate Bobby swaddled her in an emergency blanket and toted her off to the engine room for warmth. She had been frigid to the touch, and yet still breathing. Almost invariably, First Mate Bobby doesn't think twice about ordering me about for all the heavy lifting. I'm not the smartest fella on the ocean, but my youth and my muscle provided me with the strength and stamina that kept me fed since I left home at 18. I guess because he saw the way I was staring at her, because she was naked and all, he let me sit this one out. I couldn't feel too bad for staring. We don't see too many women on our runs, let alone one so beautiful and naked, with creamy, pronounced breasts and a sinuous form from her cherubic face, gentle despite the wet hair pasted over it, to her long, enticing thighs. We could even see some pubic hair with the way she had her legs crossed. She was like something out of a Renaissance painting, somehow unfortunate enough to land on our sour-smelling vessel with a bunch of rank-bearded fishermen who only dreamed about girls like her. That night in the mess hall, despite spending the whole day gutting our load, and our PVC overalls reeking something awful over our labor-spent bones, the crew couldn't help but light up at the possibilities or purpose of our new guest's origin. "Well, she ain't dead yet," Skipper Simon averred. He had checked on her just before chow time. She was still asleep, but her breath had gotten deeper and steadier. "How do you suppose she survived being underwater all that time?" Rodney the engineer mused, shaking his head with a chuckle. He was the most educated out of all of us, and if he didn't know, God knew which one of us bozos could figure it out. "Well, we don't know how long she'd been submerged," Skipper reasoned. He looked a little like Santa Claus if Santa brought fish down the chimney instead of presents. "Maybe someone brought her out here to get rid of the body, thinking she was dead," Bobby proposed with macabre undertones. "That's why she was naked and all." "Maybe she's a mermaid," I joked, though I must admit there was a time when she first came on board that I genuinely considered the possibility. But then again, I was always thinking wild stuff. My mother used to say that I should write books with all the wild stuff I think. You wouldn't think so by the look of me, the brawn and the hard features, but I had to sleep with a nightlight until I was 11 for fear of vampires and witches and monsters under my bed. Jeffrey, the cook, who indulged far less in sustenance than he did in cigarettes, one of which was smoking between his fingers right then, said in his French accent as he crossed his legs in a somewhat feminine manner, "If she is a mermaid, then I am the King of England." He drew from his tobacco and exhaled the pollutant in a cloud that drifted across the dim setting. Out the window was a wash of gray cloud. The sun had not been seen all day, and it would soon be nightfall. I awoke in the middle of the night, which was strange. Mostly I was so exhausted at the end of the shift that even the unsteady rocking of my berth, the crash of waves against the hull, or the incessant hum from the engine room were not enough to disturb my invaluable rest. But I had heard something in the darkness, the sound of hushed bare feet slapping the floor. Sometimes Jeffrey, who shared my bunk, would wake up in the middle of the night and go to the deck for a cigarette. If he had gotten into the cooking wine, which he did semi-regularly, he sometimes got up 3 or 4 times to indulge in his nasty habit. I called out in a whisper, "Jeffrey? Jeffrey, is that you?" Under sheets of blackness, I was blind, but I could feel a presence near as the end of my berth. The slap of feet stopped. All that remained were the ship's wanton groans and the hums from engine room machinery. I received no response. I waited with bated breath, still feeling a presence close to me, watching me through the darkness in a way I couldn't emulate. Then, as I began to shake off my suspicions as my unhealed paranoia for monsters and demons, the slap of footfalls returned, indeed as close as the edge of my berth, dissipating at a casual pace until out of the room. I pulled my sheets closer to my chin, grateful the absence of light hid my cowardly shame. When I woke up at 6 that morning, Jeffrey's berth was empty and unmade. I was concerned, not because he wasn't there. As cook, he woke up at 4 instead of 6, but the haggard appearance of his sheets was uncommon for a man as long-trained and routine as he. The only thing I could think of was that he really had gotten into the cooking wine that night and was too hungover, or possibly still drunk, to bother getting things together before work. I grinned, remembering the footfalls and the feeling of someone at my bed. Here I was expecting ghosts and goblins, and it was probably just Jeffrey, drunk, trying to figure out which bed was his. When I got to the mess hall, I was surprised and worried to find that Jeffrey had not arrived in the galley that morning. Bobby was in the kitchen making eggs from the carton, and the rest of the crew were somewhere between a loss and a panic at our cook's overnight disappearance. I learned that Rodney was on the shortwave with the Coast Guard rescue authorities, and Skipper was slowing the engines in preparation for circling the distance made overnight. "I think I heard him last night in the rest quarters," I explained. "He might have been drunk." "Probably explains it," groaned Bobby as he struggled, scraping burned eggs from the pan to the plates. He looked as awkward trying to cook as I would putting on a pair of pantyhose. "Probably was humming one of those French songs and went right over the railing when the ship dipped. Take one in, one goes out." He appeared as though he might have laughed at the irony if the situation weren't so dire. As if hearing her reference, the ship's stowaway appeared at the galley entrance. She was clothed now, wearing some of Jeffrey's things strangely, since he was the closest to her figure. Even still, the long sleeve draped off her. The pants fit all right since her thighs were well rounded. For a few seconds, we all just stared at each other until Bobby finally said, "Hey, you're awake." She spoke timidly, but in a foreign tongue that sounded maybe Icelandic or Danish. Bobby and I shared a concerned glance. It was as if we both were waiting for Skipper Simon to take the reins until we realized it was only us. Snapping into urgency, Bobby set down the crusty pan and edged around the counter, ushering the castaway into the galley and offering her a seat. Luckily, Skipper arrived during the ordeal and, despite his own befuddlement, relieved Bobby and me of our incapacities. We sat around her and ate our dusty eggs while Skipper tried to get as much information from the woman as he could, though the language barrier made it virtually impossible to figure out where she came from and why or who had put her in the ocean. But she didn't seem distressed so much as confused, which made it less likely that Bobby's theory about someone having assaulted her held much water. This only deepened the mystery of how she had survived her situation, but the crew was in such a dither over Jeffrey that concerns about her derivation were tentatively put aside. It was mid-afternoon when Jeffrey's body was finally found. The Coast Guard medic informed us that he had suffered from cardiac arrest and must have fallen over the side of the vessel. We spent the rest of the day in mourning, and it was decided that I, being the lowest on the rung, would take over the galley for breakfast, and there would be a rotation over dinner until we reached land. Skipper was forced by protocol to call an immediate abort on our run. We would get to port in 5 days, where an investigation would take place, though it was clear to all of us what had happened. Jeffrey's heavy smoking had finally taken its ultimate toll. That night, I went to bed extra early to make up for the sleep I would miss by getting up at 4 instead of 6. I don't know if it was the change in routine, the unsettling feeling of Jeffrey's sudden demise, or the dream I was having about the sea woman's nakedness, but I started awake, leaping up from my berth with a racing heart sometime in the middle of the night. My throat was dry, and my bladder was full. As I went from the bathroom toward the galley, I heard the faint trace of giggling over the generator and the lapping waves. At first, I thought it was only my imagination, a lingering leftover from my dream of the girl. But then I heard a man talking in muffled tones. It was coming from the deck. Usually the crew was long in bed by this point, and my curiosity drew me to the sound. Stepping onto the deck, I spied Rodney perched on a crate at the bow of the ship. Standing over him was the woman from the sea. She was running her hands through Rodney's shock of curly hair, him staring up at her with a blissful gaze and dopey open smile. She continued to titter gently. Then she drew her oversized shirt up over her head, letting it fall to her side, exposing her ample, pale breasts to Rodney's exceeding delight. I held my breath as she guided Rodney's face into her pendulous flesh, and he gorged the soft curves. His hands coiled around her arched back and caressed as she tilted her head back, blonde strands blowing in the night breeze under the moonlight. Guiltily, I crouched behind a barrel and continued to watch. Soon she freed herself from his grasp and ushered him up from where he sat, pressing her lips powerfully against his as she pressed both hands to hold his head steady. In a minute, his pleasure turned to apparent struggle, and he writhed desperately to free himself from her embrace, though somehow she overpowered him and prevented his escape. At last, she released him in his stiff form, rigged as a sculpture, as he hit the crate with a dull thud. His face was frozen in a gape-mouthed expression of horror, eyes wide and sightless. From the woman's mouth I descried a serpent's tongue undulating, and I was so disturbed from the sight I let out a weakened moan. I must have been heard, for the woman whirled her head in my direction, searching wildly for the source of the sound. From my crouched position behind the barrel, I viewed in terror the complete blackness of her eyes and the blue veins that framed her face from beneath her swaying strands of blonde. I shuddered as if I was in the presence of the devil himself, and dashed inside for fear I would imminently be named the next victim. Having made it to my berth undiscovered, I drew the sheets over my head as my pulse thundered in my heaving chest, feeling as though I was once again 11 years old and yearning for the safety of my nightlight. I did not shut my eyes until the sunrise, and then it was only a blink of relief that I had made it through the night alive. Exhausted, with only adrenaline commanding my muscles, I set about in the galley, if only to allay suspicion that I had been the one on the deck, while Rodney's corpse sat just above me on the bow, waiting to be discovered. It was the skipper who ultimately stumbled upon the body. Again, the crew went into emergency procedure. I stood on the deck and watched as Bobby futilely attempted to resuscitate. Skipper Simon with a doleful frown beside him as he failed to bring Rodney back to life. When I next looked to my right, the woman from the sea was abreast of me. A look of quiet concern pasted on her now gentle visage. The tongue and the black eyes had vanished. Rodney was pronounced dead. The cause, cardiac arrest. "It's like a curse has fallen upon the vessel," sighed Skipper, wiping his brow under his cap with a napkin. His eyes were tired, and his form, though strong in stature, was spiritually knackered. Outside the windows of his cabin, the sun beat flitting sparkles on the sharp-cut waves. "What is it you wanted to talk to me about, my boy?" My spine was stiff and my hands clammy with nerves. "It's the woman," I said. "I saw her last night with Rodney on the bow. She kissed him. Her tongue, it was like a monster's. Something out of a nightmare, Skipper. Her eyes were black, and she looked like a demon." Skipper eyed me circumspectly. I realized then how insane I sounded. "I swear, Skipper," I pleaded against the odds. "I saw it with my own 2 eyes. She killed him with a kiss." Skipper sighed and lowered his attention to his desk drawer. He produced a small bottle of Tylenol. He set it on the desk. "Take 2 of these and get some rest. All the stress of the last 2 days has made you sea crazy, and I don't blame you. You must have had a dream." I tried to protest. "Skipper, But it was no use. He repeated his command, temper rising, and I knew my attempt was useless. On my way to my quarters, I saw Bobby hauling in a line with the woman at his side. They looked to be enjoying each other's company. Her face turned to me as I crossed, and we met gazes. I felt the deepness of her stare, that she knew I was the one on the deck that night, that she had heard every word I had said to the skipper, and that she knew she had gotten away with her crime. Her grin was like a taunt, and I wondered which of us would be her next victim. My bunk was like a prison cell, lying supine, staring at the rocking ceiling. I wanted nothing more than to be off our vessel, where there was plenty of room to run, but I was trapped on the boat, surrounded by a cold, depthless ocean, with the same kind of monster my mother had told me over and over again in my youth did not exist in the real world. But they did. Very certainly, they did. Dinner came all too quickly, and as I sat in the mess hall, my berth seemed no longer a prison cell, but a sanctuary that I had longed for in a dangerous wild. The woman sat next to Bobby, sharing smiles between them as each crew member tried to lighten the sullen atmosphere with kind words about Rodney and Jeffrey, and to talk optimistically about reaching land within the coming days. I knew that we would never touch the shore alive. I decided that night that I would have to take action on my own. There was a camera in the skipper's drawer, a Polaroid. If I could catch her in the act of an attack, which I now knew would be on Bobby from the way she had been positioning herself toward him and the way she no doubt lured Rodney, then I could prove to the skipper she was the monster of which I claimed. I waited in my bed until lights out, preparing my courage for what might in all possibility become my demise. Then, when the night was at its apex, I left my quarters and set out to expose the mermaid's next kill. I crept to the skipper's cabin and opened his desk drawer, finding the camera and testing it once for assurance. The flash lit up the small room in white light and produced the ejection. I shook the photo and waited. A clear image of my surroundings materialized. I was ready. My first destination was the deck, where I assumed she would bring her victim in the same manner she had disposed of Rodney and Jeffrey. The bow rocked under the swish of the ocean, now black and endless. The deck was empty up front, and I carefully skulked sternward, listening for the sound of cryptic and portentous feminine titters. There, too, I found no life. I turned to reroute, and my breath caught in my throat, as preventing my departure was the woman from the sea. I stumbled backward under her dauntless leer. She watched me from a steady and powerful stance. She contrived a plastic, mechanical smile. "I know you want me," she gently averred. She spoke English. What are you?" I trembled. "I can be anything you want," she returned with a seductive arrogance as she sashayed toward me. "I can be everything you've ever desired." I tripped backward and landed on my backside. She towered over me, humored at my ineptitude. The camera clunked beside me, out of my grasp. "Don't be shy," she swooned. "Kiss me." I watched in horror as her face transformed into that of the demon I had witnessed that night with Rodney. Her eyes bled black and blue veins encompassed her face. The forked tongue appeared from thin parted lips and slapped across her jaw as if reaching for me blindly. In a panic, I retrieved the camera at my side and snapped a picture. The artificial light soaked her momentarily, and with a chilling hiss, she threw her arms before her face as if in pain. In her moment of disorientation, I scrambled to my feet and, in so doing, plowed through a stack of crates that crashed around me and nearly sent me to the deck for a second time. I nimbly dodged the obstructions and forced my way across the starboard aisle. When I arrived at the bow, she was waiting for me, her monstrous face snarling. She lunged for me, and I instinctively snapped the camera again. The white light induced a wounded cry, and she stumbled away. Something about the flash was poison to her. I produced another picture, the flash like lightning across the vessel, and she shrank further toward the railing. I felt the swell of courage and hope. I propelled toward her, flashing Polaroid after Polaroid, just as Skipper and Bobby appeared on deck, frantic confusion turning to frozen terror as they watched the woman tumble over the side of the ship. In overwhelming vindication and awe, I followed the woman through the cutting waves of darkness and gaped at the sight of a dovetailed fin appearing on the water's surface with each dip and dive. "What the hell did you do?" Skipper cried, assuming I had forced the woman overboard. They appeared at my side and froze as they witnessed the same unearthly combination of woman and fish shrink further into the tenebrous horizon. "My God," uttered Bobby over a drift of wind. I thought of the Polaroids and searched wildly across the gloom of the deck, finding one close and retrieving it. "Look!" I exclaimed, presenting the image of the fork-tongued demon woman. Skipper and Bobby squinted down at the photo and gasped. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but after that night, none of us ever spoke of the woman in the sea again.